Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to go to you further about our Peninsular War, and we move into the second stage of the conflict, which involves the years 1810 to 1812. This video will also include a feature point about the Battle of Salamanca. If you haven't already, do make sure you've checked out the previous part of this video series. We went over the actions that happened into 1808 all the way up to 1810. We covered especially Arthur Wellesley and the lines of Torres Vedras, so it's very important you have that prior knowledge so you understand what is happening in this video. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So first off, we'll go over a bit of background about the conflict and the situation by 1810, and then we'll get into exactly what happened after the conflict at Torres Vedras. As we established in our previous lesson, the French have really been struggling to break through the British defences. Despite having big success against General John Moore at Corunna, French haven't really had any big breakthroughs since. They've actually had major defeats at Valmiero in 1808, they lost at Porto in 1809, they then lost at Talavera, and then it peaked with Marshal Massena's forces being absolutely crushed by the lines of Torres Vedras in his 1810 campaign that Wellesley's Portuguese and British troops had built, and Marshal Massena was absolutely left in disgrace. In fact, it was so bad, Napoleon made the decision to have him removed as commander. The only French marshal to achieve any sort of success in this point was Suchet. Unlike his contemporaries, he would punish his soldiers who were looting Spanish civilians for their belongings, and he formed a good relationship with the Spanish that he had controlled under his occupation. His efforts were so good that he managed to take the city of Tarragona in 1811, using a siege campaign against the city, and then Valencia in January 1812. In just 1 year, Suchet alone had achieved more than all of his other marshals had done together. However, all the same, a stalemate appeared to have set in. Wellesley and his troops could not really attack. They were very reliant on the ports they had built in at Lisbon. Again, by building these lines of Torres Vedras, Wellesley had committed himself to this position. It made leaving the position and committing to an offensive campaign very difficult off. Napoleon, meanwhile, lost all faith in what he now deemed as the Spanish ulcer, and he made a big decision to divert 20,000 of his French troops stationed in Spain for redeployment in Europe. He had grander plans. He saw the Peninsular War as a drain on his resources rather than a campaign he could win quickly, and so he decided instead to personally launch an invasion against Russia instead. In doing so, this really was a blunder. We have to be honest here. It meant Marshal Suchet, despite having had some key successes, was now going to have less forces to defend with should his position be attacked into. It also was timed quite nicely because Wellesley was now making the decision to end his defensive campaign and pursue a war of aggression once again. And so Wellesley decides to commit to an offensive campaign. He moves 48,000 British and Portuguese troops and he launches an offensive directly into Spain itself. He leaves his lines of Torres Vedras, he leaves Lisbon behind and decides to attack Spain. He starts first with villages and forts, taking a place called Rodrigo in January 19th. He only suffers 300 casualties, so this gives him the strength and the confidence to push southwards to take Badajoz by April 6th. This was more costly though. He lost about 3,700 troops, and because of this, he also lost control of his men. Many of his officers sadly died in this engagement, and so in retaliation, the British troops got into some skirmishes with Spanish civilians. So Wellington first had to calm the situation. But once it was, he then turned to Almara and he destroyed the rivers there. Because Wellington, you see, had two key aims. He wanted to ensure that his British would not lose in the campaign, and he also wanted to disrupt French supply lines as well. So by destroying the bridges at Almara, he slowed down any transfer of supplies the French had been using in western Spain. This was quite significant because it cut off the supply route for the northern French army stationed at Salamanca. This also saved the port city of Seville near Cadiz, where they've been under a massive siege campaign from the French for many months now. The raid on the redoubt was a success, and the bridges were destroyed with only 170 British casualties. Concurrently, the British Royal Navy were bombarding any French-controlled ports in the north, and the Spanish guerrillas were also conducting their own ambushes on French garrisons, again continuing their guerrilla warfare to also halt and disrupt French supply lines. Wellington now set his sights on the more difficult task. He decided to move on to Salamanca, where Marshal Marmont was stationed with 44,000 strong army. Wellington understood that taking Salamanca would give him control over vast amounts of desert land right in the center of Spain, which meant he could launch from there a massive direct attack. He had this great vision of a three-pronged attack in the north and south to strike the centre at the capital of Madrid. He brought with him 48,000 British and Portuguese troops. The two armies circled each other for 6 days in the large desert, with Marmont eventually settling on taking some ground by the woodlands, while Wellesley chose to pick the large hills in the desert where sandstorms had erupted. And so it's very important before this great engagement to take stock of our leaders. We have Wellington here on the left, who's got a massive army force. He's got his British soldiers mixed with the Portuguese and also Spanish guerrillas, while Marmont has 44,000 Frenchmen all stationed and ready for combat. And so it's very important to understand this as we go forward, that the mindset both these generals are in. Again, we understand Wellesley, he hasn't really shown much aggression until this campaign had began. He's still very much seen as a defensively minded general. And Marmont is completely endowed with that. He admired the fortifications that Massena had faced at Torres Vedras. And of course, he remembered that Wellington was quite known for this. He never really turned this defensive rebound into an attack of his own. And so, because of that, Marmont felt confident if he could get the edge over Wellington here, he could force him into retreat again and force him out of Spain. And so, because of this, he decided to engage Wellington in the desert, to leave the woodlands area he was occupying, and to advance upon Wellington's position. So in this key battle analysis, I'm also going to be making use of some images. I do want to stress right from the start here that these diagrams are not necessarily to scale, but they should hopefully give you a visual understanding of what exactly I mean when I'm mentioning things like flank attack, reverse slope defense, terrain concealment, and that kind of thing. So as said, Marmont is anticipating that Wellington will once again fall back, and so he decides to conduct a flanking attack on the left. He has sighted some of Wellington's troops in the desert. He surmises that he has more men. He believes that they outnumber the British at this time, and so therefore he can whelm them. He also anticipates that Wellington will do a hasty retreat in the southern left flank. So with that in mind, he advances personally with 5,000 of his own men to hypothetically cut off this retreat should it happen, and in doing so, encircle Wellington's troops and capture the majority of the British army and also the Portuguese. However, Wellington was not really thinking about retreating. He instead was baiting Marmont at this time. Again, as we established, Wellington had made quite a name for himself as being quite patient. He had a boldness for attack, yes, but he had mastered the idea of terrain concealment. So what he was doing was, as what my diagram demonstrates, he was hiding the majority of his division behind the vast sand hills, and they were nice and low down behind them. There was only a small force of two divisions that were visible around the top of the hill that was scouting and keeping an eye out. These were the troops that Marmont had saw, and Marmont had made the serious mistake of assuming that these divisions were all Wellington had to offer. In his defence, the sandstorms that are raging throughout the desert over the week were disrupting his vision, and so the light cavalry and skirmishing infantry were not accurate in their intelligence. They mistakenly also believed that that was the majority of Wellington's troops. The skirmishers had sighted a supposed fallback movement some 3 miles behind the hills of British infantry and cavalry, but what it was not a retreat. It was actually Wellington's entire 3rd Division marching to the southern sector because Wellington's men had sighted Marmont's flanking maneuver. When Marmont's attack came in, Wellington counterattacked straight away with the entirety of his 3rd Division against Marmont's 5,000 men. Wellington was so delighted, he personally rode the 3-mile journey to order his 3rd Division to hurry and surprise attack the French before they conducted their own centre attack with the rest of their troops on the right. And this attack was a marked success. As you can see by the image, the true strength of Wellington's forces were now revealed, and Marmont realised he had been absolutely outdone. As the attack came in, Marmont himself was personally wounded and he had to be evacuated from the battlefield, which of course cost the French vital resources. And through this enabled the British 5th Division to join in with their own bayonet and cavalry charge. They routed a total of 8 French divisions, cutting them off completely from the rest of Marmont's forces. Without Marmont, the French officers left proposed to do a daring counterstrike on the British right flank, hoping to smash through the lines and shock Wellington into retreat. However, doing this meant they sacrificed the chance to completely reinforce their failing left flank. Should their attack on the right fail, they were going to be overwhelmed because they were losing the entirety of their left flank anyway. Wellington then revealed the true number of his forces hidden beyond the hills, unleashing the entirety of his 6th Division onto the now moving French army, who lacked the chance to defend. The element of surprise proved Wellington's strongest asset that day. It left the French centre completely wide open and allowed the Anglo and Portuguese forces to completely flood in. And from that, Marmont's men were completely overwhelmed. They conducted a full-scale retreat. However, because they had not reinforced their left flank earlier, the British pushed through rapidly, successfully capturing and killing each of Marmont's divisions. The only one that escaped was Marmont's 1st Division, with him in tow for evacuation. Wellington kept pursuing the fleeing division. However, he understood his men were tired from the long day of fighting and decided instead to circle back and ensure they captured the rest of the division to rout. The Battle of Salamanca proved a decisive victory, and at that point was Wellington's greatest in the war. The French suffered a total of 13,000 casualties, while Wellington, by contrast, only suffered around 6,000. Wellington did not waste his momentum. He pushed on to Madrid as he had intended, and he forced Joseph Bonaparte to flee with his 22,000 men stationed there. Salamanca was indeed the massive breakthrough Wellington had hoped for to change the tide of the war. But it wasn't perfect. Indeed, despite the losses the French had suffered in comparison to the British and Portuguese, weather was not on Wellington's side. The French forces reorganized at Barcelona and they counter-attacked there. They also resupplied with their troops who were coming in from southern France and entering northern Spain. Unfortunately for Wellington as well, exhaustion was setting in and his troops were slowing down. So much so, by the time autumn set in, the weather forced him to have to retreat. It was gradual at first. He hoped it would only be temporary, but a big problem from the start remained. His main supply line was now all the way back at Lisbon. Feel free to go back to our map in the previous video and remind yourself where Lisbon is. It's at the southern point of Portugal. In Salamanca, he's pushing towards the centre of Spain, and so that's a long distance away to have all your main supply wagons coming from. And so because of this, he had to gradually retreat to Lisbon and reset up his defences in Portugal. This was a massive withdrawal. He had to give up both Madrid and Salamanca in the retreat. Therefore, despite initially promising to be this great grand breakthrough to win the war, the reality was that it was not. Instead, he had to rest and resupply in the winter and hoped to get another chance in 1813. To his joy, this actually would be the case. While the end of 1812 may seem quite disappointing despite the promises and gains they'd initially achieved, the British were going to get another chance. Again, you should remember I mentioned that Napoleon had transferred 25,000 troops to go and fight in Russia. The French Emperor had committed to a complete campaign against Russia simultaneous with the Peninsular War. Again, much like how he had weakened the position of Marmont and Suchet by doing that, he also was now finding difficulty taking down the Russians. While having some success at a place called Borodino despite heavy casualties, Napoleon successfully made it all the way to Moscow, only to find the Russian Tsar had wanted this. The Tsar had committed to his own scorched earth campaign, and he burned Moscow to the ground to rob Napoleon of any resources there. The winter, of course, also proved costly for Napoleon's troops, and he had to also retreat and suffer a staggering 600,000 casualties, retreating all the way from Moscow back in towards Warsaw, modern-day Poland. The back of Napoleon's army had been broken by Tsar Alexander I. Hearing this news, Wellington's hopes returned that he may, of course, amass a true breakthrough in Spain. When Napoleon returned and learned of the great loss in Spain, he had to concede that he had no troops to go and resupply in Spain. This meant that should Wellington attack the following year, he would be fighting into a stretched and weakened French force. And this is arguably a turning point, and despite all the praise we've given to Wellington, this is a key mistake in the wider war we should be aware of. Maybe this is the turning point in the land warfare against the French. If we could characterize 1812 as a turning point when Napoleon's ambitions to conquer Spain and Russia simultaneously proved too far, then perhaps 1813 was going to be the manifestation of British victory at last. But we'll have to find that out in our next video lesson for this series. Thank you as always for watching. I do hope you'll like, commenting and subscribing as we go through this. And I thank you if you do so. Your engagement in this series is always appreciated. What are you finding most fascinating to learn about so far in this series? Is it the British tactics that are on offer? Is it Napoleon's own blunders? Is it just the sheer scale of this conflict and how Napoleonic War is actually fought during the French wars? Again, do let me know in the comments below. If you want some further reading on the Battle of Salamanca or some of the other campaigns briefly skipped over, then do check out my further reading. You'll have some more wider content there for you to explore. Again, there's always more history to learn. But with that said, I'll see you in our following video where we move on to the final years of the Peninsular War and Wellington's Battle of Vittoria. With that said, thank you for watching. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.